And I'll be talking about CloverDX 6.3, which is our latest release. We released it about 2 weeks ago. So everything you'll see today, you can already play with. You can download it from your customer portal as usually. So a quick recap of 2023, as we do every year, we released 4 releases. This was quite a big year for us. We started with CloverDX 6 and made it up until CloverDX 6.3. And so quite a lot of improvements compared to what we've had last year. In this release, there are a few things that are quite interesting. We introduced new data anonymization functionality into the product. This is a completely new thing in Clover. You were, of course, able to do anonymization before, but it was fairly manual, and this will allow you to do it much faster and in more streamlined fashion. We've made a lot of improvements in usability in the whole product, many in the Wrangler, including the ability to read and work with Excel files directly in Wrangler without having to convert them to CSV or write your own data sources. We've improved data apps by, for example, allowing it to dynamically add values to the enumeration parameters, which can be useful if your apps require some sort of additional data like lookups and so on. And we've pushed on supporting Java 17 across the board in the product. As always, we have full release notes available on our website with additional details where you can read more about different changes, especially with regards to security and compatibility fixes, where we have quite a few of them this release. So let's start with the highlight feature of the release. That's the anonymization. And our goal was to essentially allow users in Clover to easily share sensitive data with others. You can always do that by simply reading the data from somewhere, building a job that anonymizes that in some way, and then writing it to your data target. But this is always quite time consuming, especially if you have a lot of data that needs to be anonymized. So we built a set of functions that allow you to do this on different levels. As usually, we have the ability to do this on what I would call low level, starting with columns. So you can simply work with your data as you do normally, whether you do that in Wrangler or in the Designer, and you can randomize or anonymize your data in there using new CTL functions called add noise or Wrangler steps that add noise to your data. When you want to move towards a little bit bigger stuff, you can do that on a whole table level, essentially automating this simple process from columns. Instead of manually adding steps and so on to your transformation to anonymized columns, you provide a centralized configuration with your rules. So this is kind of a rule-based anonymization where you say that, for example, a column birth date needs to be anonymized in a certain way, and that gets applied to all the tables where you enable that. So that's on the table or record levels, if you will. And of course, you can take that a little bit to next level by combining the functionality that job flow and similar functions in Clover afford, where you can scan a database and for example, do this automatically for every database table, still keeping the same centralized configuration, but essentially producing a replica of your database where all the tables have been anonymized with the rules that you have configured in the configuration. I'll show you how all of this works on a demo in a couple of minutes. So when we talk about the rule-based anonymization, this is actually quite simple concept. In our case, what we've done is basically allow you to put a component in your jobs, and this component works with shared global configuration that the data owners can modify. And so the data owners have the ability to specify how their data is anonymized and do that only once. And because what we've seen with many of our customers in the past is that when you do anonymization, you want to do, for example, phone numbers or social security numbers or anything else consistently across the board. You don't want to have to manually somehow figure out how to anonymize phone numbers and then in a different database table that stores phone numbers do that differently. You want that done in the same way. So this is exactly what the rule-based anonymization allows you to do. You configure the rules once and you apply them across the board. And if you'd like to imagine the way it works, It's actually quite simple. The rule configuration, for now, we are keeping it in an Excel file because this is what the business users typically prefer. It's easy for them to edit. You can store it anywhere, and you can simply then put that into the project where the data is processed, either as a copy or you can read it in different ways if needed. The rules can be quite simple. The built-in rules that we provide allow you to anonymize dates, numbers, strings, and so on. You can do something like, for example, add noise, meaning add some randomization to your birth dates, like you can see on an example in here. You can take a birth date like this and change it. So it's still a valid date. It's not very far from the original, so it's still useful for reporting. For example, if you want to figure out how old this person is, the new date will still work, right? It might not be exactly the precise. You might get plus or minus 1 year, depending on how you calculate the age, but it will still be useful for most reporting and for sharing. And it's no longer a real value, or at least not a real value associated with the person that it was associated with originally. The same thing you can do with 4 numbers, like an example in here, where I'm doing the masking, right? I'm keeping just the first 3 digits and then doing the stars afterwards. So this kind of thing is very simple, and you configure that in the global rule configuration. And again, I'll show you how this can be done. And then the last level that I mentioned is the whole scale anonymization of a database, where we provide a data app that allows you to simply pick from the configurations that you have created before, push a button, and it loads the data from whatever is the database source and writes it to a database target. Right? So it creates a replica database. It doesn't overwrite data in place, because the assumption is that you still want to use the original, the anonymized data for something, right? It sits somewhere in your database where an application uses that, but you want to share it with others, for example, to create test data, and you can easily create a replica with just a few clicks. And since this is fairly large anonymization in many cases, right, you can have dozens or even hundreds of tables in there, the process builds an anonymization report that you can share with others. And again, I'll show you what it looks like in the demo. So that's it for the anonymization. Another interesting feature that we added to Wrangler is the ability to work with Excel files directly within Wrangler. So you no longer have to convert them to CSVs or read them through data sources. You simply grab your Excel file, drop it in Wrangler, and it will work. You can use that anywhere where you can use sources in Wrangler, whether it's as a source of a job or as a source for a lookup, right? So you can have, for example, your product table in an Excel if you'd like to use it for a lookup and so on. The Excel data source works in similar way like the data source for CSV files does, where where it figures out the layout of your data automatically. So you open the file, it will scan the header, and it will figure out the data types based on the information stored in the file. You can change some basic settings that allow you to, for example, determine where the starting point for the table is. It's not always the top left corner in A1 cell, but it can be somewhere else. And you can also read a different sheet if you'd like. You will not be able to read complicated Excel spreadsheets like you can do, for example, in Designer using spreadsheet data reader component. The aim of the Wrangler is to work in simpler use cases. If you need to do something more complex, you still can use a Designer and even, for example, build your own data source that will read those Excel files for you and parse the data out of them. Another feature that we've implemented in this release is a design refresh of the server console. So you'll see that on the demo. The server now looks quite different than it did before, but the interesting point is that we've kept the things where they were before. So you don't need to retrain your people who've used the server before, and we've just modernized the design and made sure that it's a little bit more usable by updating some components in it and so on. But in general, the way that the server console is used stayed the same. One of the bigger changes in this release is also our shift towards Java 17. So across the board, our preferred platform right now is when you use Apache Tomcat 9 together on the server with Eclipse Xamarin Java 17, and you use the same Java in Designer. By default, we already bundle Java 17 with Designer, so when you install 6.3, it will install Java 17 within the Designer installation directory, and it will run from there. We've upgraded the whole platform, so it no longer runs on Java 11. If you need Java 11 compatibility, you will have to set that in the settings for the Designer. You can still run server on Java 11, but we prefer to use Java 17 because it has, for example, a better performance than Java 11 in general. For the other platforms, for VMware TC Server and NetApp JBoss on the server, we are still keeping Java 11 support there. And so if you are using your server with one of these two stacks, you will have to enable the Java 11 compatibility in your Designer if you have Java code in your projects. If you don't, it will work just fine. But if you are writing custom Java in your projects, you'll need to enable Java 11 so that it compiles with the correct Java version for what your server uses. There are, of course, many other changes. There are hundreds of changes in this release. Many of them focused on usability. You'll see that when you try to use, for example, Wrangler or even the server. But there are a few others that will help you work with your data. The first one that I want to mention is the ability to look inside the archive files like zip, gzip, tar, and others, and list the files that are within the archive. Up until 6.3, you were able to, of course, extract data from the archive, but you were not able to just list the files. So now you can, and this will allow you to automate your jobs better when they work with data that comes compressed in one of the supported archive formats. As usually for Clover, we've made this work across all the protocols that we support. So whether your zip file or your archive is on S3 or on localhost or somewhere else, you'll be able to work with that. And the same for embedded files when you have nested files, meaning archive within an archive on different protocol and so on. So all that will work just fine. We've also introduced execution properties for Wrangler workspaces, where you can now enable debugging and change log level very easily from your server. You just go into execution properties for the workspace and either check the checkbox or pick a different log level. This will be mostly useful to the administrators trying to help their users with Wrangler issues. For example, if a connector is having some issues, you'll be able to debug it much better with this enabled than before. In Wrangler, we'll also added the ability to append to Excel and CSV files. So essentially, when you write your data into Excel or CSV, you have one extra option that allows you to append your data to the output file instead of overwriting it again. This will be useful for use cases where you, for example, add rows to a report or something similar, and you run it once per week or something like that. So you don't have to keep those Excel files saved somewhere on the side and merge them manually. The Wrangler will do that for you. We also graduated the HL7 reader component from incubation category. So now it appears in component palette in the readers category. And at the same time, we've changed the names of the elements that it outputs. The HL7 is composed out of entities called composites, and they now have slightly different names compared to what we've done before. The current naming approach is more consistent with what's standard for HL7 work. So it will be easier to use for people who work within the industry and are used to a certain way of naming their elements within their files. So let's have a look at the demo. I'll start with the anonymization, and I'll start with the, let's say, the high-level use case, right? So the big one where we anonymize the whole database. And as I mentioned, this is something that can be accessed from a data app. If you deploy it on the server, to get this, you'll have to go to the marketplace and get the library for that from our marketplace. And the way to run it is very simple, right? It's a data app. So the simplest way to run it is just to click on that. And let's let's do this, right? So what I'm going to do is pick up a sample database called Northwind, anonymize that based on the configuration that I provided in here, and write it in a database like this. The database has to exist. It will not create the database for you, but it will create the schema, right? If I check the checkbox, if you don't have the tables in there, for example, right? So you can give it just an empty database and it will create all the tables. If the tables are already there, checking the box will drop them first and create them again. This will be very useful if, for example, your layout changes, right? So you don't want to have conflicts within the structure of your tables. You can just recreate them. So once I run this, it will run for about 20 seconds or so on my computer. This is now scanning the database and reading a list of all tables that are within my my schema and running anonymization rules on all of them. At the end, it provides a report, and the report is written as a self-contained HTML file that you can download, save, and send to someone, right? So you don't have to give them access to your server or anything like that. You can simply drop this into an email and save it. And this is what the report looks like. You can see that it found quite a number of tables in my database. Not all tables were anonymized, right? Not every table contains something that requires anonymization, but the tables that do have this little privacy icon next to them, and I can look at what happened with my data. I can see that, for example, I was anonymizing company name or contact name, phone numbers in here, or for employees, I anonymized, again, names, titles, birth dates. And you can see the settings for the rules in here. So for example, for a birth date, we are adding a noise, 30 days, up or down, right? So whatever the original birthday was, it can be changed by up to 30 days in either direction. And of course, this works correctly with dates, right? So it's not going to create a 13th month if someone was born in December or something like that. So you get this kind of a report that you can share with everyone. You can see the numbers of records, the number of records that were anonymized, and so on. And the way the rules are configured is actually quite simple. As I mentioned, they are done in an Excel file. So this is the configuration that I'm using. It's quite generic, that allows you to react to just specific table. For example, in the customers table, for last name column, we are clearing all the data, so it will be empty afterwards. And in every other table, we are just masking that. So you can pick the way that you want. You can also use wildcards to match field names. So for example, every field that has a name in the field name like this will be masked, and so on. So this allows you to quite quickly create rules that are fairly generic and allow you to anonymize large data sets. And this same configuration, this is the centralized configuration that I mentioned when I was showing you the slides. And the way it's used is you simply grab the anonymized component from the library, right? I have the library installed in here. It only has one component inside, and you can connect it to any data source. And as long as the data layout matches the expectations, like for example, the data table name is the same and column names are the same, you'll be able to anonymize your data. It doesn't have any other settings besides that. You can override the table names and so on, but all the settings are essentially kept in this shared configuration. So it allows you to very easily create one configuration, maintain that in one central place, and then all the data can be anonymized consistently. And of course, as I mentioned, there's the ability to also anonymize data using CTL functions. So I'm not going to show CTL functions, but we do have new ones that allow you to just add noise to various types of data. What I'll show you is the anonymization Wrangler. Right, so let's have a look at contacts, right? I have a job ready that does that. I'm reading data from a simple data source. It's actually a library that gives me contacts, right? So persons' names, addresses, and there are phone numbers and birth dates over here on the right, emails, and I can anonymize that in different ways. So in here, this is the masking step that allows me to mask the phone numbers. The way I decided to do this is to keep just the first 3 characters without parsing the number or validating it in any way. I just keep the first 3 characters and throw everything else away. Similarly, for emails, I do something a little bit more complex where I throw away the name and keep just the domain, right? So I can see that there. And this is one of the new steps for anonymization that allows you to add noise to different kinds of data. So for date of birth, this step, the way it's configured, it adds 20 days of noise. So it's as simple as this, right? You select the column and basically configure just how much noise to add to that. You can pick different units. So I can move it by a couple of years. For example, if I do 20 years, I'll see the numbers jump quite a bit here. I save it. And so it adds 20 years and moves the date within that. So it's as simple as that. When you look at the anonymization steps, we have 3 anonymization steps in here. And there's also a new category with data anonymization in the toolbar. It's context sensitive, so it will only show you the steps that apply to whichever column you have selected. And for dates, it's only the add noise. For strings, it will show me also the mask text. And so this is a very simple way of anonymizing your data in Wrangler.